The first is that the goal of trauma-informed practices is to create warm, welcoming environments where students can feel safe and connected, teachers feel supported and valued, and people can focus on building and sustaining meaningful relationships. We are uplifting this goal today as we have this conversation among colleagues. Trauma-informed work is not therapy. Drama therapy is using the tools of theater to work on things with a trained therapist. This is not what we're going to be doing today. I believe great good can come from therapy in whatever way works for you. And as theater people, we have a great deal of empathy. It's wonderful, and we can tell a lot of people's stories that way. But that vulnerability can also be a superpower, but it can also be something that we use, can be a wounding issue sometimes. We want to be careful. We want to have good boundaries around that. So today, while you're in this space, I ask you to engage in ways that are helpful and safe for you. So we hope that these conversations today are going to be productive. To do that, you need to be in a solid place. We're going to talk about some big, maybe heavy, maybe uncomfortable things today. I am asking you to take care of yourself since only you know what you need. Check in with yourself, being aware that this check-in can take a lot of different forms. This session is being recorded, as you just heard, so you can come back to it later if you need to step away. It might also mean turning off your video, standing up, moving around to release some energy, getting some water, quietly listening. It might mean actively sharing in the comments or the chat with your voice. We won't take any variation of what you do personally. We understand that being in a place to talk about these things is something for everyone, and it's a different place. A productive conversation is the goal of today's session. We hope that this space can be adaptable and supportive for you and your learning. We've created a Google form that you can use at any time to give us feedback. The form is a great way to let out any energy that you might build up during the workshop. If you feel you need to step away, feel free to use it then. If you can, wait and use it at the end of the session, when you can share your overall impressions. The form will be shared with you multiple times, so you don't have to worry about going back in the chat and finding it at any point. We have awesome chat moderators who are going to be able to access anything that you need throughout the time. They've just introduced themselves, so feel free to reach out to them when you need them. As part of our session today, I'm going to hand it over now to Victoria to lead us in our next introduction section.
Thanks so much, Andrea. So part of our session today entails consideration of our location and positionality. And we're starting with a step in that direction now. And I want this to hopefully be something that we build on and consider as part of an ongoing work in progress. So we are all coming from different places. I'm a cisgender white female, and I'm currently in North Haven, Connecticut, where Quinnipiac, Wappinger, and other Algonquian-speaking peoples stewarded the lands. This is just one place that holds meaning for me, and I'm going to turn now to my fellow facilitators once more to share a location that holds meaning for them. And as they do so, similarly invite you in the chat to share where you're joining us from today, or a space or place of meaning for you. And as you're able, share the corresponding Indigenous group who historically lived there. And our moderators are going to provide a link in the chat to help with that. So Andrea, I'll turn to you first.
I have settled, for now, on the unceded lands and territories of the Chumash and the Fernando Tavian, who trace their ancestry through the San Fernando Valley, Malibu, Paso Robles, and the San Francisco area.
And could I, sorry, Anna, could
yeah, no, that's my turn. I am currently on the ancestral lands of the Comanche and the Kiowa, and Colorado, Oklahoma, and Ohio hold lots of meaning for me, and those lands that, and we'll talk more kind of about the other placements as well. So, and I'm going to pass it off to Anna.
Thank you all. I'm zooming in today from the Quinnipiac, Waugussett, and Wappinger lands, unceded, now known as Hamden, Connecticut. And I'm really happy that I can be in this Zoom room and the fullest expression of myself. I'm a queer white woman. I use the she, they pronoun series, and places that have meaning for me, as well as my new home, as my old home of London, where I moved from 5 years ago. And it's very important to me. And I thank Andrea and Victoria for allowing us all to be our fullest selves in the space.
Thank you all for in the chat and verbally reflecting for a moment on the lands on which we reside. Given that we're coming from all these different places, it's important to us to acknowledge the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of Indigenous people who have been here since time immemorial, and to recognize that we need to continue to build solidarity with Native peoples across the Americas and the world. And I want to similarly acknowledge that the lands where I am located and where many of you are no doubt located is occupied territory. It is the traditional land and ancestral home to Native American, Indigenous, and First Nations people. And we acknowledge that the United States and other nations were established on a foundation of theft, genocide, and enslavement. And there continue to be anti-Indigenous policies and system in place. We understand as well that we are all privileged in the technology that we have to join together today, and that this is not available to many Indigenous communities and communities of color. And similarly, that this access contributes to changing climates that disproportionately impact these same populations. So we're taking a moment to recognize and honor current Indigenous populations, as well as knowing that this is not just our past, but also our present. And I want to acknowledge that the United States wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the free and enslaved labor of Black people. I want to honor the legacy of the African diaspora and Black lives stolen due to violence and white supremacy. So this land acknowledgement is not enough. And I should note, I very much am taking much of this language from my fellow facilitators here today, which they kindly shared as part of their work. And wanting to view this as an important social justice and decolonizing practice, not just checking a box, that helps us see ourselves as settlers on Indigenous lands and what that means for spaces of teaching and learning correspondingly. I'm going to share one final comment here from a student who I know, Megan Lada Gupta, who's a Yale undergraduate, and how she works to encourage us to strive beyond mere acknowledgements of land and spur us to action. So I'm going to pop one final link into the chat here before turning it back over to Andrea.
Thank you, Victoria. That was really powerful. The other way to expand how we think about land and place is to think about how it's shaped us. So one of the things that informed me in becoming a trauma-informed educator is that I went to a high school before Columbine. You can all now guess how old I am. And that high school had regular bomb threats. We had, you walked through metal detectors on an almost weekly basis as they randomly selected them. While I was in college, there was sit-ins and protests, and the system started to change in some ways they didn't. And you could push and you would start to see difference. And how did that actually become part of that larger system as I started to learn those systems and structures? As I grew up and started shifting in different places, one of the places that impacted me the most was that I moved to Egypt about 5 days after the Raba massacre, which is considered one of the second largest humanitarian outrages by a modern military entity against unarmed civilians in our current knowledge, the other being Tiananmen Square. And I was moving there to teach into a society that I had never been in, and into students who were living in the middle of this, being expected to come to school, to go to college, to teach these students, and to learn in ways that were considered normal. And I'm not sure how we ask our students to do that. And so I started reading, because that's what I do, because we're educators, and that's oftentimes where we retreat to. Then I came back to the United States and I was like, oh, after 3 years in Egypt, I'm returning to things that I knew, things that were normal. but I was moving right back into the center of Pennsylvania in the middle of Trump's campaign. Highly divided school, highly divided area. There was hate crimes happening, there was violence against different groups, and identity and how visual that was and visible that was suddenly became something that was really known. Then I moved out here to California and I was like, wow, okay, this is going to be totally normal now. Now I've been in the middle of fires, evacuations, school shootings, and trauma is everywhere. And what really became very clear for me, even before the pandemic, is that trauma isn't something that just is these big events that we think of. That's how it was initially framed when I started learning about it. It was like, this big thing has happened. How do I deal with that or the aftermath of that? Versus trauma is actually pervasive. It is everywhere and it is throughout most of our students' lives in some capacity. And to the extent that we acknowledge that is actually really important. So that's how I come to that work. And that's why I think it's so important, because we want to start thinking about how do we structure classrooms that receive all students, no matter what they come with, and not to know their stories, but to be prepared to teach any student who walks in the door. So I ask you to take a moment or two and reflect on what you bring and what your experiences are that put you into this room with us today. Now, while we're doing that, because sometimes that can be a big heavy thing, we're going to do a little bit of grounding. Because when you think about it, your body, your dorsal vagus nerve in system is 80% from your body to your brain and only 20% from your brain to your body. So you really want to send good information through that. So we're going to do some breathing and we're going to do a little check-in here with us today. So we're going to do what's called a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to ask you to take advantage and use the senses around you that you have available to you. If at any point in time a sense does not feel good to you or you're not able to access it at this point in time, please feel free to use that moment for gratitude in whatever number or capacity you are able. So find yourself in a comfortable position. You can do this with your camera on or off. I will be doing it with my camera on, and we're going to start breathing at a pace that is comfortable for you. Some nice deep breaths in and out, extending your breath, coming into your body, and really feeling your breath move through you. With this next breath, I'd like you to take a moment and consciously name 5 things that you see around you. Maybe not the first 5, but 5 things that are present and intentional in your space. Now you exhale. With your next breath, 4 things that you're touching. This could be the feel of the clothing on your body, the feel of your body on the seat, maybe what your feet are touching through your socks or your shoes, glasses on my face, the weight of the earrings in my ears, what it is that I'm feeling to be present in my body in this moment. Next breath, 3 things that you're hearing. If you have us on headphones, this one might be a little bit harder, but really see what you can hear through those noise-canceling headphones. Reach deep into that auditory spectrum. Can you hear something from my mic that might be picking up other than just my voice? What might be 2 things that you smell with this next breath? Put you really in presence with your space and the things that are around you. And finally, 1 thing that you taste. On this last breath, come back, focus on your camera, If you've turned your camera off and you feel comfortable turning it back on, we would love to see your facial expressions, your neck, your heads. We enjoy that feedback through the process of our conversation today. And thank you for joining and engaging in that moment with me.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I remember asking Andrea, I was very worried when we did this process if a breathing exercise that could be replicated. And Andrea said to me, don't worry, this breathing exercise can easily be replicated. And you were absolutely right. Thank you. So Anne and I are now just going to talk you through some Zoom protocol. We've been on Zoom for an entire year and a half. I'm sure many of you know exactly what you're doing, but what we're trying to do in this session is talk about the modeling we're doing and actually model the behavior as well. So the first thing I'd like to say is that you're all doing wonderfully, but if you're not speaking, please mute in case there's any background noises. And the mute button can now be found to the bottom left of your screen along with the stop video function.
As Andrea said, we encourage you to turn on your cameras, but understand all of the reasons that you might not want to. My animals have decided today is the day to be the barkiest and the most active that they ever are in the mornings. So it's a little exciting on my end too, so we all understand. So again, just you're welcome to do whichever you feel most comfortable as the session progresses.
Now, if you'd like to raise your hand, we are inviting people to put comments in the chat and questions in the chat, but if you'd like to raise your hand, if you look down the bottom of your screen, you'll see right at the end on the right, a reaction button. And if you click on that, there's a whole gamut of reactions that you can give us. You can give us applause, a thumbs up, crying with laughter, the heart, as I just did for Anne's animals. And at the bottom, you'll see a raise hand function. So please just click on that, and we will get to you as soon as possible.
Anna and I will be monitoring the chat as Andrea and Victoria share with us. If you have any tech support that we might be able to help with, or questions that you don't want to share with the whole group but would like voiced, you can either send them to Anna or I. You can also put tech in front of your comment to help us know that you're trying to get to us.
Absolutely. So we will be monitoring the chat, as Anne said. So if you want to send us a private message, you can absolutely, just searching for either Anna Glover or Anne Medlock. We should be right at the top because we're your presenters. But if you want to include everyone, please feel free. And as Anne said, if you just spell out tech, if there's something that you particularly want us to do, perhaps I'm not driving the Zoom room correctly, and maybe you can hear me typing in the background. So please feel free to raise that up too. And what do we do if technology fails?
We breathe and we potentially log back in. I'm thrilled that there's only one Zoom, and that last summer we had multiple sessions with multiple Zooms. So I think we're doing great as it is. We remember that this is being recorded, so if something happens, you can always find it later. And again, if Anna and I can help, we are happy to. But it's a Zoom. It's all going to be okay.
And in that spirit, pets, children are welcome. We have to be real. We're not working from home. We're sleeping at work now. That's the reality. So please don't worry if you're saying something. And just a note on the recording, we will be stopping the recording prior to the breakout rooms, so that anything that gets shared when we get into maybe more personal, we won't be sharing that to the wider group.
And speaking of the breakout rooms, we will mostly be doing them randomized, but if you know that you don't want to share, or if later as we progress, you decide you just want a breakout room of one, which is fair, that might be the only quiet time you get all day, put an exclamation point in front of your name and I'll move you to a breakout room by yourself.
That's great. So to do that, if you go to I've completely forgotten how to do that. I thought that was going to the three dots at the top right of your screen, but that is not doing that for me right now. Victoria, is that the right way? Thank you.
You can hover over your individual box of your own. There's 3 dots should appear in the upper right of that. And the menu, I think it's the very bottom one, says rename, and you can rename yourself, pop that exclamation point in front if you prefer to hang back, think quietly during our breakout session. And again, if you're running into any technical issues, please feel free to reach out in the chat or raise your hand.
Thank you so much for stepping in there.
And I just learned that if your participant box is open, you cannot use the 3 boxes or the 3 dots above your name. So then you can change your name through the participant box.
Wonderful. So is it okay if we move on to session goals? I think we've kind of covered the Zoom protocol. So we wanted to, again, we said we were modeling what we would hope for in class. And sometimes when we're teaching, we can get straight into the topics. And what we're trying to say today, what we're trying to suggest today is that actually coming into teaching after the pandemic we've had, we need to lay the groundwork so that people can access the space in the way they need to. And it was the hope of both the Education Commission that Anne represents and the Safety and Health Commission that I represent, that through this session, we will recognize that there has been we're now in the aftermath of pandemic, and there is trauma present, not just in the students, but also in those of us teaching as we go back into the academic year. We wanted this to be a conversation because we wanted to give you a chance to talk to colleagues about the challenges and lessons, and perhaps people who are not in you don't work closely with. So it's actually wonderful to share things with Anne sometimes, because I'm not worried that she's going to judge me in my teaching, because Anne and I work in different institutions. And finally, to explore the ways that we can help ourselves. Andrea's already beautifully modeled that through the breathing exercise, and talk about how we put the pandemic in context as we shift back into the upcoming academic year. So coming back into how we model things, I'm going to turn back over to Victoria now, because one of the things that we need to know is like how do we get people back into community? And there's ways that we can access that.
Great. Thank you, Anna. And we've been scaffolding in some internal reflection, some sharing reflection as we did through the acknowledgement and thinking about where we're all joining from, our positionality. So now we're going to ask you to reflect further, especially with an eye towards that first goal that Anna shared. So I want you to take some time now to reflect on your experiences during this global pandemic, racial violence, other contextual factors that are impacting teaching and learning over the past 18 months and will continue to do so into this fall, even if for some of us, our institutions might be returning to what was normal. So in keeping those in mind, I'm going to invite you to take 3 minutes here to quietly reflect or free write, or I suppose free type, thinking about these questions I'm also popping in the chat here. When you think back on this experience, I know it is ongoing, it's not in the past, but bringing it forward to this moment, thinking about how have your ways of being changed? And for you, the focus might be on thinking about how you interact with others, friends, family, colleagues, maybe how your personal priorities have changed in this context, how you even spend your daily time, or your role as a teacher, and also thinking, as we will together further in a few moments, about what you're hoping for the future in terms of your teaching. There may be things that you want to bring forward, things you want to change, things that you hope this new context will support thinking critically about what teaching and learning looks like. So I'm going to ask you to take 3 minutes. I'm going to put my timer on. Feel free to turn your camera off for this if you'd like, but to quietly reflect. Then I'll invite you to pose responses in the chat at the end of those 3 minutes, or to raise your hand and comment verbally. But again, first taking 3 minutes quietly to yourself, and then I will welcome us back to share responses to these prompts in the chat. All right, I'm seeing Donna's 3 minutes, at least on my watch here. So at this point, want to invite you to share any responses, comments, thoughts based on these prompts. Once more, welcoming your thoughts in the chat, or to raise your hand and share verbally. Part of the reason that we took 3 minutes just for this kind of headspace is to think about at least something I'm hoping to carry forward from this experience, which is to give more time after posing a question to people in the room, in part because we all process differently, and that additional time can be valuable in a variety of contexts, but also even thinking of the students I know who are really nimble on their feet or speaking in drafts, and that sometimes that pause and asking them to consider further, that second thought or comment might offer some different perspective or different ideas. So again, here, welcoming your thoughts, your comments. How are you thinking differently about being in the world right now, and what you're hoping for in terms of future teaching, whether that be a specific idea or more generally, what is this going to look like in the future? Yeah, Scott, I can see your hand. Please feel free to unmute and share.
Well, I guess one of the things that I have taken away from this is how welcomed I took the break. I think I was getting to a point in my life where it was just kind of like work, 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 production, production, production. And whereas, you know, obviously I as a college professor, I'm privileged in the fact that I didn't lose income or anything else like that due to the break. And I have to acknowledge that. But on the other hand, too, whereas people, some of my friends and colleagues lost a sense of identity because there wasn't work, I didn't necessarily feel that. I actually felt like now I had time to explore the other areas of my life that I had been neglecting for so long. And now going forward is trying to, you know, create that all important life work balance, you know, so that, you know, as a technical director, you know, is there a way that I can work with production calendars and production goals to be able to say, you know, we don't have to work every Saturday, or we don't have to, you know, do these ungodly load ins and things like that. It's you know, the art of it is important, but you know, it's it's not important for me to kill myself in the process of it anymore. So that's one of the things I'm trying to take with me forward going from this.
Scott, thank you for sharing that. And I'm also seeing a lot of resonance in our chat here about thinking more towards work-life balance, reconsidering priorities, and even also how to get back into the mode of what work was like beforehand and what that regular cycle was. The busyness sometimes is something that's exciting, but also now might also be, we're all quite drained in a lot of respects. So getting back to that level is not only difficult, but finding that refocus. And I'm seeing further comments about making, continuing to make courses accessible. And when we move into breakouts, I'll look to identify one or two resources there where we've been hearing from students a lot about the desire to continue forward that question of accessibility, access to not just technology, but thinking about different modalities of engaging with content, different ways of participating beyond just call and response, for instance. But I'm hearing another theme I want to highlight. I know that in terms of time, I don't want to take away from some of our future sections here, but that balance between maintaining academic rigor, but also offering leniency, also offering flexibility in due dates or in other respects. And I'm seeing that with a lot of the comments in the chat too. And this is something where I think I'm hoping we will delve further into as we move along here, but I just want to highlight as well that I think this might become a point of comment and discussion in our breakouts, because I think there's a lot going on here that might be fruitful to unpack further as we move there. So I'm just looking towards my fellow facilitators and inviting further comments, especially with regard to that final theme now, if maybe we can take another minute or two to discuss. Andrea, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to add something there?
I was just going to say that I think that one of the biggest things going forward is, what are the expectations that we carry and why? And where are those expectations actually really valuable and really serving the students and the necessary outcomes? And where are those expectations something that we are holding from previous experience or from a norm that is no longer necessarily serving us. And so really stepping back from what it is that we have been doing and going, how is it that this has been in existence for so long? And is that really actually in service to what it is that we need to do? And is that how we have to make theater, or is that just how we have been making theater? And is this how I need to structure this project in my class? Or what is it that I want them to walk away from this project? And one of the things that I heard coming up a lot when I was talking to people around pandemic things was when we really lost time. I mean, we lost 3 weeks out of our semester. Was that how did we get down to what those actual objectives were? And how did you streamline that into that core? And how can we do that now in a more pedagogically responsive way versus going back to putting things in, and what are the really important things that we actually need, and being aware of that and building that in a department-wide intentionality instead of in a panic response kind of way. So I think that that's a lot of the conversations that hopefully we'll be having collectively as communities and as our department communities going forward. So I think that those are really important things to think. Yeah.
I'll just add that in terms of what I've been seeing from a variety of disciplines as they look to explore anti-racist pedagogy and to explore what does the discipline value and why. And I realize that there's that tension, especially in the professional world of technical skills that are necessary that need to be learned in an efficient and timely manner versus what do we value and why, and those bigger questions. So I know that at least speaking with other instructors, finding time to have those conversations and to talk further about building in opportunities to consider those. I know it's not easy, but I've been hearing greater emphasis. Andrea used the term intentionality to consider what are we saying is valuable? What are we giving time to? And should that include a discussion about the discipline, or what is going to move us forward towards a better world, given what we've been experiencing over this past 18 months plus. I was going to say 18 years, and it certainly feels like that sometimes. I'm seeing further comments in the chat here that are fantastic about really pointing towards emotions as well. And I think part of what I was hoping to share here is in my own journey as I'm looking towards teaching this fall. I'm teaching a course about dismantling narratives of empire. And even thinking based on this past experience, normally I have a statement about there are difficult topics here. Please be in open communication with me as we move forward about how you're feeling, how you're doing. But that realizing that really sets a tone of problem solving rather than seeing emotional response as part of learning. And I know for me, that's one of the things I wanted to highlight here, that as we think about practices that we've always done. You're here in this room today. I know you care about your teaching, you care about your students. If we think about inclusive teaching, if we think about structuring in time for ourselves as well as our students, that layering on this context is something that I know I'm thinking about in terms of those practices. And in addition to that, thinking towards what you all have highlighted here, a desire for giving your students structure while allowing flexibility. So for instance, I've seen the usual inclusive teaching practice of backward design, having goals that you share at the beginning of the semester and seeing how assignments and activities map onto those that support student learning in that way. I've been hearing from instructors thinking towards maybe students should identify a goal for themselves, or I could ask them about how they're seeing those goals as exciting or which ones are challenging, and using that as a kind of check-in object throughout the semester. And on top of that, thinking more towards inclusive teaching as something that can have flexibility, is towing that line and that balance as something to explore together with students. Incorporating student voice and in terms of getting to know them and building a community in the classroom, inquiring not just, why are you taking this class? What's your professional trajectory? But inquiring, what have you seen? What have instructors done or have you done that supported you as a human being in your learning? And how can I similarly work towards that? Or what in terms of coming back, how have your priorities shifted? And even as you feel comfortable sharing how your own have, what you're thinking, some of what's being shared in this room, even that kind of transparency, which is a little different from just here are course goals and how things hang together, but allowing for some vulnerability and even some consideration of let's together co-create what we think is important for this course. Andrea, others, Andrea, I know you had a few comments to share too, or maybe things that you're seeing pop up in the chat to add to our conversation.
I wanted to say that I think that part of what, as we're looking into these classrooms going into the fall, one of the big things coming out of this is that I think we've also been running so long on kind of that full press of survival, and that what is that constant response of getting through and responding to the immediate needs. And I think that being able to, for yourselves and for the health of your students and your ability to be there for your students, be sure that you are taking care of yourselves. And I know you've heard this before 1,000 times, but it's really, really true, that you are going to need some breath and some space. And that is going to be feeling very different when you go back, probably unlike anything we've had before. And I want to tie this, I know that we mentioned grief a little bit in the intro and in our blurb, and so I want to tie this in just a smidge here, that it's going to be different for everyone, and what works for you may not work for anybody else. We do not know what this is going to look like long term for anyone coming out of the pandemic. It's going to be different, and we don't know what it's going to look like for our students back in these spaces. The other thing is that we really don't have clarity on how their experiences were on the other side of this. So that's something we don't have a lot of data about yet. And as much as we may know some of those individual stories, we're going to have students who have, in essence, lost sort of in their minds that year of college, that year of socialization. I was talking to my nephew last week, and he's going to be a sophomore down in Texas. And he's been living with some friends, so he has this very now tight-knit friend group, but he also has no idea about what it's like to be in a collegiate classroom, even though he's going to be a sophomore. And so he's like, well, I'm sure it's fine. Like, I just keep doing work, like I've been doing work. So it's going to be this huge disconnect in a lot of different ways. And it's going to hit our students in really different and really random, hello sirens, really different and really random points. And so you're going to have a lot of situations in classrooms that you don't normally necessarily have. So being prepared for that is going to be something that's going to need you to have some extra capacity. Some things to keep in mind around that, and I just wanted to put that out there, that there will be, and I use the stages of grief just because they're going to be present. It's going to happen in different ways. We're grieving things we don't even necessarily think about losing. People who've moved during the pandemic that we didn't really get to say goodbye to, that aren't going to be there when we go back in the same ways, and how those spaces have shifted and changed. So for me, I'm just going to go through these a little bit quickly, but like shock, denial, that how did this happen? Why did this happen to me? What does this look like? Anger at yourself, frustration with family, frustration with the situation, looking for someone to blame as things come out. That will come up more quickly and more probably resonate with people faster. Bargaining. There's going to be a lot of people who are like, oh, I've lost this year, now I need to have extra fun, or I need to do extra things, or I should be doing more of this now because I've lost this time. And there's going to be those extreme reactions. We have heard about the depression. It's very real. The loneliness, the anxiety around that, numbers are skyrocketing. And then what we're hoping for is some sort of balance with the acceptance starting, with that understanding and that moving into a sense of hope and integration. And I'm not sure that I'm always that hopeful about it. Yes, they are definitely not linear. And you can go in and out and back and forth, but that we can get that hope and that integration of understanding where the pandemic actually starts to pressure and be our pain points. And it's scary and it's hard, and we're going to be with that for a long time. A couple things that I want to put out there as potential things to keep in mind. Consume media and content that is good for you, not negative. And for some people, that's where, and I use Instagram as an example. I love Instagram. In some ways, Instagram is an amazing community, and I have some really powerful and close friends on it who I've never met in person. But then there are times that I can get in there and like doom scroll. So be careful where you are and how that's mentally hitting you. Acknowledge and accept your feelings. It's really important that you're living in that space, that it is a place of sort of acknowledging what's going on, and you're not just pushing that down to get through, because so much of what we have been doing is trying to get through to the next thing. And then also seek out people who engage with you. This is really important. Even if right now, as I'm talking, take a moment and come up with 3 or 4 people who are your community, who are people you can count on, who are people you can call for totally different things. Maybe they may not be the same people for the same things, but those people who support you. These can be friends, these can be coworkers, these can be people who maybe your pastor, your choir leader, anybody along those lines, whatever it is for you that are forming that support network who you can rely on, because those people are going to help keep you going through. And that meaning is really important. And then this one, I love this one so much. Honor when you realize that something is big and you've lost it. And sometimes it may not be big to everyone else, but it's big to you. And it matters how it feels to you. It doesn't matter how it feels or how it thinks to anybody else. Honor that, and sometimes make a ritual or make a mark or make something to signify that. That can be a letter, that maybe could be like going out to dinner. It could be taking an intentional walk, something to signify and or give that thing time, space, and intentionality, so that you acknowledge that grief and that space and give it air. Because by giving it air, you're honoring it, and you can kind of also then start to breathe with that instead of fight that in your body. And that's really important, because if we fight that, we're going to be living in that frustration and anger and carrying that with us, and then it's going to explode at a crazy wild time. And we carry a lot of things with us that we don't always consciously know about. And a big one for these is, sorry, I needed water as I talk, my mouth gets super dry. We carry a lot of also unconscious biases that are also impacting us as we move through all of this. And I wanted to talk about this a little bit, do a little bit of the science about this. And across areas that have been studying this, I mean, psychology, economics, sociology, all of them, some really concerning but helpful to know data has emerged. And that is that consciously and unconsciously, humans store experiences that later instantaneously impact your automatic decision making and cannot be turned off. These are not things you can think your way out of. These are not things that you can just sort of override. And these are put into your system by things that you take in. These are things other people say, things you witness and give weight to. So this shapes how your biases are formed. Then groups that are stereotyped can, through exposure to biases, alter their behavior to conform to those stereotypes, even when the stereotype was not true. So this means that if you have a very strong opinion about someone and you are in potentially a position of authority and you can actually impact others' behavior to take on negative stereotypes through your actions and beliefs. The good news is that can also work in reverse. So an example of this was teachers were told that a random group of students showed potential for great IQ. Those students, by the end of the year, then were actually testing higher because the teachers, through the unconscious bias of being told that these students had higher IQ potential, had supported them. So it can work in a positive way, but it can also work in a negative way. So then how do we think about this? Well, you can't suppress your biases because if you try to do that, it's more likely to come back and be harmful. So first, you want to acknowledge it. There's the Harvard implicit. You're probably all familiar with this at some point in time. Check it out. Spend a couple hours doing some tests just to see where you are. When you figure out kind of what it is that you might have leaning towards one way or the other, then you have a starting place. The great news is that bias can change. So once you know where you start, you can make good and conscious decisions to start changing your bias intentionally. So there are lots of systems and lots of school related things. Your school might possibly have one. Check with your learning center to see if they have an affiliated group first, because we're not putting any in the chat. They cost money and your school might have one, so we're not endorsing anything here. But if you don't, there's a lot of things you can do on your own. One of the things that you can do that is the easiest thing to do, think about the media you consume and start shifting your goals. So, for example, if you come up that you might potentially have an anti-Asian bias, what can you do? Well, start normalizing that. For example, watch Kim's Convenience on Netflix. I know it sounds really cheesy, but this is a really great way to see that normalized in everyday context, to bring that into your life and to put that into your system as this is a regular thing. This is something I see. This is something I believe. These are regular people living regular lives. That is what starts to shift your bias. If you need ways to do that, you can also change the art around you. You can change things in your environment. There's a lot of things. Google is going to help you a lot in this system. These are just some, places to get you started. Other ideas, just in your general teaching as you start to approach it, instead of being deficit focused, be growth mindset focused. That will benefit all of your students across your classroom. So that will really help. And then the other thing that I want to put out there is really start to be intentional about how you use your words. Because the more intentional that you are and taking that breath, because once you've started to acknowledge that you have the bias, you can start to counteract that as you move forward. Putting that diversity, equity, and accessibility and all of that into not just your syllabus, but into the everyday practices in your life will start to change how you live and how you see things. So that's going to make a huge difference on your departments. I'm going to turn it back over to Victoria here.
Everyone, Andrea, thank you for your questions, your comments, your ideas, your support of each other that we've seen verbally and in the chat. We're going to move to our final section of today where we're going to talk more together as colleagues and supporting each other and thinking towards this upcoming year. So I'm going to turn it over to Anne and Anna to talk about our next portion where we'll be using Jamboard and a breakout session.
So I've just put in the chat a link to Jamboard. It is very similar to Google Slides. If you haven't used it, I'm going to share my screen really quick, just so you can see what it will look like. The first slide has the breakout room prompts. And then as you click to the right, you have my examples of all of the different methods you can use to comment in Jamboard, which is part of why we thought about using this instead of Google Slides. You can draw, you can import pictures, you can use sticky tabs, you can use notes in different types of ways. So it's just another, just felt different. And so a nice kind of break from Google Slides. And then each breakout room has its own individual slide that we invite you to share your content. If you have asked to be in a breakout room of your own, I didn't make you a slide, but if you want one, I can make you one. I didn't know if you needed that time to reflect for yourself. Oh, and then so the breakout rooms are, I'll open those in just a sec. If you have any questions or comments, you are welcome to come back here. Victoria and Andrea will be popping into the breakout rooms just to help make sure conversation is happening. If somehow you end up in a breakout room with no one else, please come back and I will put you in another room. And if you have any questions, as always, feel free to use the chat or vocalize them.
So we had a big conversation when we were putting this session together about breakout rooms, because they're real Marmite. You either love them or hate them. But we're trying to model what we would like you to maybe consider putting in your teaching practices. And for some people, the thought of speaking out loud in a wider group is terrifying. But also breakout rooms, you can actually create them, as many of you will know, to cope with specific groups. So as a queer person, I might be much more comfortable speaking with other people who have my lived experience. And so it might be possible to create a room for me and people that I identify with, equally creating spaces for Black, Indigenous, people of color who might need that time to speak honestly. So although you love them and hate them, we do encourage you to use them. A little bit of breakout room etiquette. Again, as with anything, please feel free to access the breakout room as you need. We do invite you to turn your cameras on, because in a smaller group, it's actually really nice to see people's reactions and faces. But again, as you need. We were thinking that somebody might keep an eye on the time. We're going to give you roughly 10 minutes. Someone else in the group might want to take a couple of notes, and we were hoping that someone in the group would want to report out. Everyone doesn't want to take the report out group, so I invite you to quickly introduce yourselves, and then using the alphabetical order of your name, the person that comes first in the alphabet is your timekeeper, the person that comes second is your note keeper, and the person who comes third is the person that would report out to the group. You can also feel free to have that conversation. So I'm going to, I've finished with the etiquette. I'm going to hand it over to Victoria to just remind us of the prompts.
Wonderful. So you'll see, as Anne mentioned on that first slide, these prompts for your discussion, but feel free to take it somewhere else, especially based on what we were seeing in the chat earlier. So we're asking you to consider, what is one thing you're thinking differently about coming from this session? How might that impact your actual classroom or conversation with other instructors? What are you going to do to protect yourself, and how will you hold yourself accountable to ensuring that level of protection, that practice of self-care? Or you might consider a new way of thinking or tool you'll use, or perhaps you're looking to find that approach or tool and you have some colleagues to talk with or to bring us in to offer some suggestions too. I'll offer two more technical notes. One being that as you enter the breakout room, just take a note of which number it is so you can find your corresponding slide on the Jamboard. And then on the final slide, there are one or two starts for resources that we've provided, and we'll continue adding as we hear more from you. You can also feel free to add resources you found helpful related to our topic or teaching generally. So I'm going to look towards Anne and see if we're ready to launch those rooms.